I can see a few people coming in, so I'll just give them a chance to settle down. So, well, good evening, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all, especially our two distinguished poets, Marcus Amaker, closest to me, and Andrew Motion on the other side, to the first evening event of this year's Charleston Literary Festival. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank this event's sponsors, Judy and Bernard Cornwell. I hope you're in the audience somewhere. Thank you. It's a particular privilege to introduce two writers who've been honoured by being created Poet Laureate, perpetuating a tradition that goes back to ancient Greece, when they would have been crowned with a wreath of laurels. We just thought it was a little bit early to decimate our plants, a bit early in the festival, so you'll have to imagine the laurels. Marcus Amaker was named Charleston's first Poet Laureate by the Mayor of Charleston in 2016. And in fact, he told me he's just rather reluctantly relinquished that post after 6 years. It was originally intended to be 2 years, but he made such a success of it that it was continued for 6 years. Marcus's poetry has appeared in many magazines and journals, and his 9th book, Black Music Is, was published last year. His work has been studied in classrooms across the country and has been interpreted for jazz, dance, opera, and drama. And one of his poems is actually on a Grammy-nominated album. He's also a graphic designer and electronic museum, as well as an educator. The British writer Andrew Motion was appointed Poet Laureate by the late Queen Elizabeth in 1999. He was the first English Poet Laureate to serve for 10 years. Previously, in a custom that goes back further than Wordsworth and Tennyson, the role had been a lifelong appointment. Andrew is the author of 13 books of poetry, biographies of poets Keats and Larkin, and is publishing a memoir as well as a new collection of poetry next year. He's also the co-founder of the Poetry Archive, and check this out, everybody, dedicated to the production of recordings of significant poets reading their work aloud, available to all free of charge. And Andrew is currently Homewood Professor of the Arts at Johns Hopkins University. Now I'm going to take the opportunity to have a short conversation with Marcus and Andrew, and I'm going to talk to them about the role of Poet Laureate and what it meant to them, and then I'm going to invite them to read some of their poems. So may we welcome them again. Okay, so now this is my chance to ask some of the questions I've always wanted to ask. So, as a Poet Laureate is typically expected to compose poems for many public events, and I'm sure you all know this, I want to know from both of you, did you find this inspiring? Did you find it frustrating? What effect, what impact did that have on you?
You can go first. Oh, wow. Yeah, so it has been a blessing to be in this position because it's really been a challenging experience for me and definitely a rewarding experience as well. The parts where I'm challenged the most are those parts where I am asked to write a poem for an event. And whenever I speak about this, there's a voice in my head that's like, first world problems, you're asked to write poems, you know? Woe is me. But it definitely is a different sort of hat that I put on because the expectation is there for it to be inspiring, or for it to really encompass an energy of like a particular event or a particular space. Like I wrote a poem for the Wine and Food Festival a few years back, and when I got that assignment, I was like, okay, I'll just write about wine because I love wine. Like who here doesn't? But then I thought, it's got to be, I have to really dig in deep and find sort of the layers that are there. So those are the poems that take the longest for me because I'm thinking about like the audience a lot. And in my other poems, they might be published, they might not. So I'm a little more free to experiment. So
thanks, that's really interesting. Andrew?
when I was appointed, the expectation was that I would write poems about events in the royal calendar. And I tried to sort of blank that out because I could see that that was going to be extremely difficult for some of the reasons that you've given. But there was also the idea that I might write poems about things that happened nationally. And I tried to concentrate on those during the 10 years that I was doing it. To be completely honest with you, I found writing the poems about the royal family an absolute screaming nightmare. Mainly because these were people I'd never met. I feel what I feel about them, and this isn't the evening to talk about that. But my poems depend on something much more than simply sort of reacting to an event that's given to me in some sort of cold way. So I think about a month after I was appointed, Prince Edward got married. There were some expectations I would write a poem about Prince Edward. I mean, I hardly need to finish the sentence. I think even Homer might have had difficulty with that. So I quite profoundly disenjoyed that side of doing it. But there was an enormous compensation for those difficulties, which was to do with the opportunity that role gives, as yours gave you, the chance to do good for poetry. So endlessly going to schools, trying to sort of talk poetry up, trying to find a way of making it possible for a conversation about poetry or a conversation in poetry to take place along the other kinds of discourse that fill up our sort of daily babel and babble. And in particular, setting up the Poetry Archive with my friend Richard Carrington, one of whose children lives in Charleston. He's not here, is he? No.
Certainly should be.
Well, he probably doesn't know that I'm here since I didn't tell him. But that made it all okay. In fact, it made those 10 years feel as though I was leading a useful life.
Is there any poem you wrote during that period that you would want to own? Any public occasion poem?
Well, none in response to an event in the royal calendar.
No, it doesn't have to be the royal family.
But yes, there were some things that I was very pleased to write about, and probably would have written about anyway. And that's really where this comes to life for us, doesn't it? That if there's a coincidence of the things that we might normally respond to, with the expectation that we might, then that's all good. So, for instance, and perhaps I might read this in a moment. My tenure coincided with not exactly with the 100-year commemorations of the outbreak of the First World War, but at least with the long lead up to that. And as part of that, I got to meet the guy who was then the last surviving British soldier to have fought in the First World War, a man with a wonderful name of Harry Patch, completely sort of Agincourt name, who was 111 when I met him. And I wrote about him, and I was very pleased to do that. I might have done that had I not been laureate, but the fact that I was made it sort of inevitable, and I was pleased about that.
Is that a poem you're going to read?
I will, yeah.
Okay. Marcus, what about you? Is there a particular poem, looking back now, that stands out there? It was a public event, public occasion. It was challenging, but I feel proud of that.
Yeah, the 2020 mayoral inauguration poem I wrote, specifically for that event, and it ended up being a poem that I kept and I was very proud of, and one that I weave into my shows and stuff as well. And what I'm thankful for, the mayor here and the city really supported and really supports our voice and my voice. So there was never any sort of censoring of my work, because I put some things in there about the LGBTQ community, because that was an incident that happened right before I started to write that poem, and I felt like I can't paint Charleston in all these beautiful, bright colors when there's a lot of stuff to really talk about. So I'm thankful that there was never any censoring of my work, and that was what I was proud of as well, to be able to speak on that as well as have it be right for that experience and for it to work. So yes.
Are you going to share that poem at some point tonight?
Yeah.
You will, but not now, but you will afterwards.
I will share that.
Okay, so actually you both touched on this, but I'm going to ask you something which maybe you can then elaborate a little bit. So the laureateship, which you've both experienced, it could be one of several things. It could be simply an accolade conferring status, which actually it was for both of you. You earned that status. It could be a voice for public occasions, which you've both spoken about. And it could be an activism role, encouraging interest in reading and writing poetry, which I know has been important to you. And it could even be a form of protest, which you've now referred to. How did you navigate all these possibilities?
Shall I just quickly say something about that? I think the role that I inherited had not been interpreted in quite the same way that I tried to interpret it
say
myself.
Who you inherited it from?
Yes, well, my immediate predecessor was Ted Hughes, a marvelous poet, but not somebody who wanted to get up at 6 o'clock every morning and go on the radio and talk about how important it was to get the kids reading more poems, though behind the scenes he did a lot in that cause. But I think it had been interpreted by Ted and more emphatically by people before him as something which sort of played the game pretty respectfully, if I can put it like that. And I wanted to not be disrespectful exactly, but I wanted to change the kind of role that the laureate had and make that person much more an ambassador for poetry, as I was saying earlier, than it previously had been. Partly because I felt, as I think you feel too, that there's an enormous amount of work that could be done for poetry within schools, but also because I think an awful lot of people, having had perhaps not the happiest encounters with poetry in schools themselves, grow up to feel that it's either a kind of elitist thing or it's somehow detached from reality, however one construes that word. And I wanted to try and talk about it in ways which were serious and, if necessary, quite complicated, but also gave people the idea that poetry, even if we do end up talking about it in quite complicated and sophisticated ways, is essentially something that's really quite primitive and simple. Heartbeat, pulse, rhythm, all those sorts of things. So that's what I tried to do. I mean, that's the line I tried to walk.
Marcus?
Yeah, all of the above on everything that you listed. I think being an artist by definition means that you are an activist because it's breaking out of this role that that has been played out for us, capitalist world, like you have to go to work 9 to 5, and then you have to get a promotion, and then you make a lot of money, and then you die. So being an artist breaks you out of that role that has been played out for us, and I think that in and of itself is activism. But especially for me, particularly being in a city with terrible history of racism. Just look at the street names, look at the statues. So it would be disrespectful of me, I think, and the ancestors who came before me, for me not to use this power to speak about that. So that's definitely a part of it. But yes, being in schools is my number one joy. I really, really enjoy that. Was able to publish a book of poems from students last year. So that to me is just, again, being able to give that gift to students who, in my mind, the publishing world, and almost, going back on what you said, it's a very old school sort of thing, and a lot of students, I know for me, when I was younger, being published was such it was such this unreachable goal. It felt like I had to have like $1 million or something to get my name on paper somewhere. So to break that down for students is really fun for me and important, and hopefully it inspires them to keep writing and just expressing themselves in not live by any rules. Like, we are artists, we could do whatever we want. We can make up words, make up a language, things like that. So I'm always encouraging students to just be free,
To experiment and to be creative.
Yeah.
I think you sort of gradually led me to something. This is a more personal question, and feel free not to answer it, either if you don't want to. So in in Auden's, put it that way, in Auden's famous poem, In Memory of W.B. Yeats, in one line he says, as though he were addressing Yeats, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry." Did anything hurt either of you into poetry? Do you want to start?
Yes, I think that's probably true in my case. And I dare say in most people's cases, though what the thing is that does the hurting, of course, varies enormously. It is a more personal question. In my case, it was to do with a very serious accident that my mother suffered when I was sort of 17, that kind of thing. Which made me feel that poetry was a way of, I think I had just, and as far as I can remember, I had just started writing poems when she suffered this accident. And I can remember having a conversation with myself at the time that went roughly, if I can remember life before this event as crisply as is possible, then that might be a kind of counterweight to what's happened to her. And I think that feeling has stayed with me throughout. I mean, I've written about her a lot, and she feels very present in my mind. It was very, and I'll say a little bit more about this when I read, but it was very interesting to me and unexpected when I came to live in America 7 years ago. I now live in Baltimore, teaching at Johns Hopkins. That I needed in some way to sort of bring my ghosts with me and let them go here so that I had some company on this side of the Atlantic. So she is still very present in my mind, though I dare say the existence that she has there doesn't bear that much resemblance to the person that she actually was, because this is now a very long time ago and in another country.
Well, I know that was a very elemental experience when it threads its way through your work. What about you, Marcus? I think you've touched on it already, but...
Well, for me, it was a speech impediment that I still carry. So the fact that I stutter, I'm going to read a new poem about that. When I was younger, I wasn't conscious of this or even aware of it when I was younger. Writing for me was just a way to express myself. But I think the older that I've gotten, I've realized that there was something in me that knew that when I spoke, I was not able to fully say what I really want to. On paper, it was all there, and it was easy, and it was fun to play with language. And also, when I was younger, I framed my speech impediment as a hurt, but it isn't that. It is a part of me that I've learned to love through therapy. Thank you. But definitely when I was younger, it was more pronounced, I guess. It was hard for me to say any sentence without stumbling over myself. So, and obviously I'm thankful for it now. So the fact that I was able to just, I'm an only child, so I was just in my room a lot, just writing and just being a moody teen. Thankful that my parents were very much patient with me during those years. But yes, it was the speech impediment, because I started going to speech therapy when I was really young. But when I was writing, everything I could say anything, and it was great. Yeah.
Andrew, you want to say something? You can talk to each other, not just to me. Yeah.
That's so interesting to hear, and I wonder whether you feel as I do that the trick, except trick is not quite the right word for it, but the thing that I think we have to do about these things, I mean, if something does crash land in our lives early on, or indeed at any time, of course we want to write about it as the thing that it is. But I also think that I shouldn't speak for you, but in my case, what I wanted to do is to try and find a way of writing about it which made it emblematic of something sort of larger about the condition of life itself. In other words, to make a larger point by paying attention to the particular details of something specific. Otherwise, it just looks as though you're talking to yourself.
And to give it a shape and a form?
Yeah, that's part of it, but also to sort of find the allegorical or metaphorical values in it.
And I have to say that's one of the reasons I love being a poet, because I think that when I really started to love this art form was when I started to connect with other people, to not write so much about myself. I mean, my early poems were all about girls, trying to get dates and stuff. And then I realized, if somebody doesn't know me or know the person I'm writing about, they aren't gonna relate to this poem. And I definitely remember the first time I truly connected with somebody through my work was I wrote a poem about a friend of mine that had died, but I put at the end of it sort of a universal theme at the end. And there was a guy in the audience who walked up with tears in his eyes because he had just lost his good friend. And he's like, I haven't been able to express it. Can you print that poem for me? And I was like, yeah. And that was when I realized, I'm like, yeah, what we're doing is, it is connecting people. There's something special about it. There's magic. You don't get that at concerts, all the time. People are, drinking or partying or on their phone or whatever. But when it's a reading like this, hopefully nobody's on their phone here. But there is an intimacy to what we do. But I think there's also a universalness to it too, which I think is the magic of what we do. So.
Okay, so before we're going to actually experience what you do, one more question. You've both, and I hope this will lead into your reading, you've both written poems for music. What appeals to you about combining music and poetry? Do you want to start this time, Marcus?
Yeah, this is my mac and cheese. I love... So I write lyrics for operas now, so I'm doing that, which is fun to just see how an opera singer interprets the words and the energy that is there. Like speaking of a poem or poems that I'm asked to write, like I work with some opera companies to write scripts and poems for things, and those are actually fun because it's all about capturing that energy and capturing that mood. I love it. I have done a lot of 40 albums now. A lot of it is instrumental stuff, but I also do spoken word on top of music as well. I just think it brings out the color in the language. There's layers to what we do, and I think that you can't get that layer if you are just reading it. If you hear it in the poet's voice, there's going to be a sort of a music there. So I absolutely love it. I still consider myself a musician who happens to write poems. I started making music when I was 10 years old. It's just what I know how to do well. And I could talk about this forever. So.
Well, I'm not going to let you talk about it forever, and I know you've written some lyrics and you've written about a musician as well.
I have, yes. I mean, I'm not in the same league as you in this, but I have written about music quite a lot, and I listen to music a lot, and my wife plays the piano very well, so we have a lot of music in that house. And I have written a few things that people have said to music, and I would love that to happen more often, I must say. When I was laureate, my laureateship coincided with Peter Maxwell Davies being in the sort of equivalent position for music, which is rather wonderfully known as the master of the Queen's music, presumably now the master of the King's music.
Master.
Exactly. And I liked Max very much, and we got on very well, and I used to go and stay with him up in the north of Scotland in quite a regular way. And it seemed to me always that the thing that, to try and put this in a nutshell, that the thing that music did for words was to slow them down, even more slowly than poetry can move, which I enjoyed. And what happens the other way around is that it makes people music makes people who are listening to the words reach for their Kleenex faster than it otherwise might, and I like that about it too.
Okay, well, thanks both of you for being so open and forthcoming. Now let's hear some of the poems. Let's hear some of your work. You going to start, Marcus?
I will, yeah. All right, so I have 6 hours up here, right? No? No, I don't. Okay, nope, I don't. I'm gonna do 5 poems. We'll just see how long this goes. Thank you all for your energy. This is a self-explanatory poem. It's called Give Yourself Some Flowers. And in the beginning, God gave your body a checklist. Keep your heart on beat and your lungs dancing with oxygen, not passive to air. Make sure the path of your blood slows down for checkpoints and avoids bumps in the road. Train your nerves to keep a balanced pace and stay within the lines of steady flow. Push forward without putting too much pressure on movement. Remember to return to water when your spirit and its frame are in drought. Treat your body like a well-rounded planet built for all seasons, or pretend you are an adaptable star. Float in the black and stay there if you need to. Save some light for yourself. In other words, rest like the sun does. Schedule some time to stay out of sight when too many people praise warm energy. Keep in mind all of these things when depression tells you nothing is working. Keep in mind all of these things when it tells you there is no invisible force connecting us, when your veins are stopped by blood clots, when your bones are dry and the water is too quick to boil. Keep in mind all of these things when depression tells you that the soul is like the body, made to be broken, open to deterioration and doubt. Yes, keep in mind all of these things, and remember, even when it seems like the clock isn't ticking, you were made perfectly for this moment in time. This is a poem about my city that I started writing in 2006. So I wrote like the first stanza in 2006, and then another stanza like 2007, and I've just continued writing. Who knows how long this poem is going to end up being, but this is where it's at now. This is called The Pulse, a poem about Charleston. We live in Charleston, where the sidewalks scream on Saturday nights and the corners rotate budding musicians with skin-tight dreams, where strings of pearls search for salvation, then sweat out their frustrations on the backs of rooftops, where the homeless sprout like weeds through concrete seeking $2, a handshake, and a little bit of sunshine, where the humidity chokes you out of your breath, but you still manage to speak to the spit-shine waiters who serve $95 bottles of wine, where 2 blocks away, a $5 pitcher of liquid gold spills on the canvas of sticky floors, where love lingers on cobblestone streets in narrow alleyways, but the smell of racism is the foundation for first and last impressions. I live in Charleston, where shadows are surrounded by the ocean and sea-seeing people gasp for air from knee-deep bills and dirt-cheap thrills, where those with no sense of history's melody sync with the songs of the city's slaves, where the poets scrape stanzas off of streetlights, and if they scream loud enough, maybe someone won't be afraid of the dark. We live in Charleston, where church steeples and cranes look over us and multicolored houses house live-in servants, where fast-rising hotels rise above slow-moving clouds that cast floods on the corner of America Street, where parades of one color get one day to celebrate, then hide in the shadows of gentrification, where Gullah cuisine is too expensive for Gullah people, the holy city, where the steady beat of jazz is the beat of our streets and the dialect of our past writes future conversations, where bridges and bike lanes break bread with politics while some progressives preach peace with uneducated tongues, where the angel oak tree is young compared to our vanity, where $16 burgers are sold in the middle of a food desert while every community wants a piece of the pie, where grandmothers sit on porches watching us change while the problems of our city remain the same. Charleston, where the yoga studio calls itself holy, and the vintage market calls itself holy, and the whiskey drinkers go to church to feel tender and holy, where potholes and potheads blow smoke through steam-filled summers, and the pandemic was brushed away like palmetto bugs brushing away extinction, where some of us dream of an underground scene to hold on to the spirit of elevation, where halter tops don't stop in the winter for people with disposable incomes and opposable thumbs, the holy city, where the hurricanes are coming, where the hurricanes are coming, where the hurricanes are coming. Another Charleston is being built above our heads. Maybe this one won't flood. And this is my last one. Thank you all. Oh, geez. Who decided to call us black and white? When I look at my skin, I don't see black, I see brown. Brown like the color of sand, it's a brilliant tan that needs no sun. Brown like the mahogany tree bark grounded in the summer, whose green leaves make the transition into fall. Coffee stained by the autumn's cool breeze. Who decided to call us black and white? When I look at my wife, I don't see white, I see brown, just a lighter shade than mine. Brown is the cinnamon that colors her iris. Brown are the arms that wrap around me during a bronze sunset. Brown are the layered bricks of our home's foundation. Who decided to call us black and white? When I look at all of you, I see shades of brown, a sea of one color, ripples of love floating along a sea change. There are so many words used to divide us, to fool us into seeing ourselves through foggy lenses. We are more than a box-checked statistic. We are more than a census. I am not black or white. I am awake. Thank you.
Yes. Well done.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry to stop you listening to Marcus reading all evening. Fantastic reading, thank you. I'll read this poem about Harry Patch that I mentioned. So he was 111 when I met him. Poor guy. And not very much older than that when he eventually died. I think he thought, as I thought about him, that he was going to be the one who backed the trend and just didn't. He seemed to be going on for such a long time. Anyway, So this is a poem called The Death of Harry Patch. A fire step, by the way, is that thing that the troops stood on before going over the top. If you see those films of soldiers in the First World War about to go over the top, often they're standing a little bit off the bottom of the trench on a slightly raised platform, and that's called a fire step. When the next morning eventually breaks, a young captain climbs onto the fire step, knocks ash from his pipe, then drops it, still warm, into his pocket, checks his watch, and places the whistle back between his lips. At 0600 hours precisely, he gives the signal. But today, nothing that happens next happens according to plan. A very long and gentle note wanders away from him over the ruined ground, and hundreds of thousands of dead who lie there immediately rise up, straightening their tunics before falling in as they used to do, shoulder to shoulder, eyes front. They have left a space for the last recruit of all to join them, Harry Patch, 111 years old. But this is him now, running quick sharp along the duckboards. When he has taken his place and the whole company are settled at last, their padre appears out of nowhere, pausing a moment in front of each and every one to slip a wafer of dry mud onto their tongues. This is actually, it's nice of you, but don't. Because otherwise I'll start listening for it. And this is a poem about discovery and about the virtues of not knowing where you are. I mean, these days, of course, it's quite difficult for us not to know where we are, because all we've got to do is turn our phones on and it'll tell us. Though actually, of course, doing that only tells us where we are in a rather particular way. In other words, I think our sense of the wider world diminishes because our phones can tell us where we are on a particular sidewalk. This poem is called The Discoveries of Geography. If only the stories were not so tempting. But from day one, I started to embroider, and in no time was suggesting a country far to the north, where fish are as large as dragons, and even minor administrators eat off gold plates and sleep on gold beds. This is why I have packed in my birch canoe a robe made of the feathers of more than 100 different species of bird, so that when I have finally crossed the ocean, I will have a ceremonial costume rich enough to impress in my encounter with the great Khan. We have an excellent longboat with outriggers, and therefore travel dozens of miles in a day. Furthermore, and speaking as a navigator, I can predict every fickleness of weather and also the change in direction of currents, sometimes dipping my elbow into the water to feel the slightest change in temperature. These are the reasons I shall be considered a savior by my people and die in peace. In my own mind, I am a simple man who threw his spear at the stars and landed there himself. I now have in my possession a map, 2 handfuls of mud scraped from the bank of our sacred river, flattened into a tablet, baked, then pierced with the blunt point of my compass, while I spun the other, sharper leg to produce the edge of the world as I know it. And beyond, the salt sea on which I am perfectly at home. In this way, I look down at myself. I think, I am here. Astonishing how many horizons are open to me. At one time, mountains of smashed slate, at others a vast delta of green and crimson light. And every day a different shoreline ripples past, bearing its cargo of white sand and dark palms. Very beguiling they appear, but all encumbered, all spoiled by the tantrums of our local gods. Out here there are storms too, but in the religion I have now devised for myself, I am convinced the shaping hands have pulled away from us at last, so the earth hangs with no support at the center of what? That is the question I have in mind to answer. You might suppose better charts would help me, but in spite of their much greater accuracy in terms of coastlines and interiors, and the intricate detail guaranteed by developments in printing, not to mention the understanding of perspective, empires still lie about their extent and stability. These are the simple deceptions. More difficult as I continue north to my final encounter, and wave crests flicking my face grow colder, and daylight a more persistently dull dove grey, is how to manage my desire to live in the present for all eternity, as though I had never left my home. It transpires, the last part of my journey requires me to abandon everything I once knew, even the gorgeous costume made of the feathers of more than 100 different species of bird. No matter though, it is delicious among the constellations, as the planets begin to display their gas clouds and the beautiful nebulae their first attempts at stars. When I look over my shoulder to see my own blue eye staring back at me, I realize before I disappear, I still accept what it means to be lost. Naughty, naughty, as Auden used to say. I moved to America in 2015, and my wife and I have done a bit of exploring. This is my first time in your beautiful, complicated city, but I'm very pleased to be here and very pleased to meet you all. Thank you for being here. One of the first trips that we took, and this was during the time when I was worrying about that business I was mentioning earlier about importing my ghosts, we went to Chincoteague, which some of you probably know, on the coast not so far away from here. And I'd been thinking about my mum, and in particular I'd been thinking about Tabitha, who is the... Not a lot of people know this, though I dare say all of you know it. I didn't know it before I discovered it shortly before going to Chincoteague. Tabitha, who is the patron saint of seamstressing, seamstresses generally, but people who do tatting of one kind or another. And my mum was very keen on doing embroidery. So this is an unrhymed sonnet about Chincoteague and thinking about that. Well, when I say unrhymed, actually it doesn't rhyme at the end of the lines, but as you'll hear, it rhymes quite sort of elaborately in the middle of them, here and there. Walking in Chincoteague among the reeds, stitching thin air and sunlight into shade, I thought of Tabitha, the seamstress, dead, St. Peter at her bedside calling out, "Get up," which led me suddenly to you on winter evenings from the time before, hunched in a cone of yellow light, one hand poising your needle like a trophy saved from chaos that might any moment now descend again, the other with a thread you lifted to your pouting lips and kissed to dampen and make sharp enough to pierce the needle's eye before you pulled it tight and took a breath and cut the thread in two. And I'll end by reading a poem, which is a villanelle. I'm extremely wary of fancy forms. Hopkins, where I work, in what any other university would call the creative writing department, which we rather grandly call the writing seminars, Hopkins has a very strong tradition of encouraging people to write in formal forms. And I thought when I got there that I'd better prove that I could do it too, so that I could just sort of square up to my students when the occasion arose. This is the only villanelle I've ever written, and I have no wish to write another one. And it took me about 5 years to write it, so. It's about somebody I know who I like very much, who never turns around when she's walking away from me, when I say goodbye to her. You know that thing? People who want to turn around and just sort of give you one last wave, and they don't. Utterly crushing. So it's called The Truth Is. You never look back when you walk away. And hard as I might stare at your bowed head, telling myself it shows you want to stay, the truth is that it may not, or it may, because for reasons always left unsaid, you never look back when you walk away. Is it your pride in holding me at bay, or kindness, shielding me from truths I dread, telling myself it shows you want to stay? Or is it proof of a profound dismay you cannot bear to show me, so instead you never look back when you walk away? I doubt that, frankly. And I have to say, I'd rather spare you grief and be misled, telling myself it shows you want to stay. One thing is clear, at least. Another day ends with me hopeful but dispirited. You never look back when you walk away. I tell myself, it shows you want to stay. Thank you.
Well, we've ended up playing musical chairs. We have a little time left because we started late. I just wondered if anyone in the audience would like to ask any questions. I've sort of hogged the stage. I've been very self-indulgent. Now it's your turn.
Going a little bit above, and by the way, thank you, this has been wonderful, above where we've been talking. Over the past few years, we've seen the growth of artificial intelligence start to create music, start now to create, and I put that in quotation marks, the visual arts. So far, it seems like literature and perhaps poetry has been a bit of a bulwark in preserving the humanity in the arts. And how do you see that potentially evolving, coming? Do you perceive this as a potential threat, or do you think there will always be a place for the deeper stories that can't just be replicated by type in sad story about World War I and Harry Patch?
Well, yeah, I find myself making fun of technology and social media a lot, but then I feel like it is our job to adapt with what's happening. And that's what artists have always done. Like, there's always been, in my mind, just a cycle that we go through. Like, people are scared that some sort of technology is gonna take us away and suck our brains out and all this stuff, and then we end up like adapting to it, and there's always soulful people out there doing wonderful things and still having wonderful conversations. And another technology comes and we get scared that our brains are gonna get sucked away, and then we, so that is just another thing that I feel like the train is coming, like let's just like get on it and we will adapt to it, because I feel like when artists stay in their lane and just stay in their lane, like things are gonna bypass them, Not that it's all about that. I really enjoy artists who have a singular vision. But I think that there are ways that, this art form, poetry, is a very flexible art form to me. It can be used in a lot of different ways. So imagine using it with the AI, created things. I think that there's an opportunity there to work with it instead of work against it, because people are always going to have souls. so we're always going to be able to create stuff outside of that. For every Amazon, there's going to be your corner store. So for every AI written poem, I'm going to be writing my ass off. So that's my answer to that.
Yeah, I feel rather similarly, I must say. And in my mind's eye, I divide this into two parts, I think. One is, are poets going to be made superfluous by machines? I mean, there are plenty of machines writing novels, and there are plenty of machines playing chess very well, and so on and so forth. But machines don't have personal histories in the way that we human beings do, so I guess that we should be able to rely on that to keep poems sort of intact. I dare say machines will write some quite interesting poems, but they'll be posed by machines, not posed by human beings, and we'll just have to get used to making that sort of distinction. And then there's the related question of, perhaps it's even the other side of the coin, which is, what can these things do for poetry? And it was really thinking about that led me with my friend Richard Carrington to set up the Poetry Archive, which, as Diana was saying, is if you don't know it, and I think it is more used it is used quite a lot over here, but it is more used in the UK than it is in the US, is a website on which poets read their own work. And it's all sort of surrounded by material that's helpful for educators. And there is something very interesting to say about that simply in terms of statistics, I think, which is that while the amount of review space given to poetry books has shrunk almost to nothing now, and while the sales of poetry books is much reduced as well, we have something like, actually slightly over, nearly now 500,000 people using the website every month. So you could say, in fact, it would be accurate to say that there are more people reading poems now than there's ever been before in the history of the human race. So good. I mean, what they're doing with it is another question. Are they sort of having an intimate relationship with it in a way that you can with a poem on the page? I don't know, but at least the stuff is there and it is being read. So I think we should cheer up a bit about it. I feel optimistic about it.
The very first book I listened to on tape was written by a poet, and of course I'm terrible at remembering names, but it's Natalie Trefethen, perhaps? And the name of the book was Memorial Drive, and it was about the murder of her mother in the Deep South. And she, in the book, read it aloud herself. So if you listen to the book on tape, she's reading it, and it was the best thing ever. And that, because her voice was the voice of a poet reading a book. And I wondered if either of you have thought about writing books about writing poetry, for instance, or something like that. Have you thought about writing this was an autobiography, but writing a book as well as writing poetry?
I've thought about it, yeah, because I love to experiment with different art forms. I'm not trained to write a book that way yet, so if I were to do it, it would be a completely different type of thing. But I have I've actually thought about doing a book under a different name too. I think that would be fun in a world that I think is so feedback loop based. It would be interesting to just put something out there and not care about likes or something. But yes, I have thought about that. And yeah, the audio book form is a lovely way to interact with poetry. It's wonderful. So yeah. I've written quite a lot of literary biography, and I review a lot, and I write a lot of essays and so on and so forth. So absolutely yes. And I think all the prose that I've written has been recorded either for Amazon or
one of those sort of audiobook people. And this memoir, which Diana mentioned at the outset, I'm about to record. And the reason I'm mentioning it is not to give you, in a sort of self-advertising way, simply, but to say that it's actually not really a memoir in the way that word is ordinarily used. It's more an account of my meetings with poets now dead. So it's a sort of way of honouring them. So I think of it really as a sort of, and it's a kind of literary endeavour, not a confession. It's called Sleeping on Islands.
I know we've got some more questions. I just want to make a comment. We do have, right at the, more or less, well, the last day of the festival, that some of you may know, and I hope you know, we have an audio actor who's going to come here and read stroke perform T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And that comes from an audio production that was commissioned this year because it's the anniversary, it's a T.S. Eliot anniversary. And he's supposed to be an audio star. So if you're interested in that, have a look for it. And it's the last day of the festival. Now, there was somebody wanted a question here. What did you, Suzanne, wanted to ask something? Did you have your hand up? No. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
Thank you. My question, I think, builds or echoes the first question that I think stems from probably a shared in this room anxiety about the place of poetry in the contemporary world. And with the celebration of Eliot coming up at the close of this poem, you feel like Eliot put the weight of the burden of responsibility for resurrecting the culture on his shoulders. And I was struck also, you mentioned the poem by Auden. And Auden, so it said sometimes he would come up with a line and find a way to work it into a poem, whereas Yeats was busy building grand mythologies and then tearing them down and building them back up. And so in the context of that, I'm really interested in how poets write. Do you write with a sense of each poem being a new experience, a new adventure, or is it fitting into a broader message or world or tapestry that you're creating consciously or unconsciously? Now, and that you're both Poet Laureates. We're celebrating you here for that. You're obviously both public poets. Congratulations for that. So if you can disentangle from what I just said, questions, but they're really about method and where is each poem an entity, or is there a poetic world you're building?
Wow, that's a good question. So, yes, I'm always a fan of artists who create worlds, like world builders. I'm a big fan of Bjork. I'm a huge music fan, much more than literature, which is interesting that I'm at this festival. So artists that do that really, it's just like they're almost creating their own language a bit. So when I write my work, I think in those terms. For me, a poem doesn't make sense if it's out of context of some sort of broader theme. So, and even if I have to make up a theme to write the poem, I will do that. It helps me to get things going. So when I was writing poems for this book, The Birth of All Things, I had the cover, already in my head. I knew what the color scheme was going to be. I knew what the font was going to be. So it helped me to write within that framework, write within that world. So whenever I write a book, I think about it that way. It's like I'm creating like a concept album, or something like Pink Floyd, like I'm doing stuff like that. So in my mind, poems, especially when you read a book of mine, I construct it like it is an album. So there's themes, you've got your fast songs, and you're inevitably gonna have a slow song, and you're gonna have a side A, you're gonna have a side B, things like that. So that's just how I do it, is because I'm a music fanatic. So that's how I create.
Yes, it is an interesting question. I think my feelings about this have rather changed over the years. I think perhaps when I was younger, I used to have a slightly sharper sense of what I was doing as I was doing it. Now, because I'm so wary of being too knowing about myself, I try and write in a state of sort of intelligent incomprehension, if I can say that. Well, it's true, isn't it? I mean, the good poems that we try to write are the result of a negotiation between a side of us which does know what it's doing and a side of us that absolutely hasn't got a clue what it's doing. And as we get older, it gets harder to suppress the side that does know what it's doing, particularly if we spend a lot of our time teaching, which I do. So I almost cultivate not knowing what I'm doing until I'm quite far advanced in it, either in an individual piece or in the much sort of more extended process of putting together a book. I don't really know, in fact, I quite definitely don't want to know what I'm doing until I'm quite near the end of it. And then I can kind of lift it into the light and say, oh, I see that sort of. And I don't really bother to edit very much anymore as I'm writing either. I just sort of put it in the book and leave it there. And then in months, even a year's time, I'll go and try and sort it out. The trouble is that my handwriting is very bad, and I often can't read what I've written, so...
Well, I think we're going to bring this to an end now. I'd like to thank Marcus and Andrew for the very generous response to the questions I flung at you and for wonderful readings. Thank you both very much.